Welcome back. Well, yes, we will be talking about the coronavirus disease health protection regulations 2021 signed by the president. We've got two gentlemen, as you might have seen in that welcoming slide. Dr. Paul Ananaba, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, joins us via Zoom from Lagos, and Professor Oyewole Tomori also joins us this morning from Ibadan. Gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for joining us today on the program. Well, part of the provisions of this regulation, part one, which was talking about restrictions on gathering, indicates that one, at all gatherings, a physical distance of at least 2 meters shall be maintained at all times between persons. Two, notwithstanding the provision of Regulation 1, no gathering of more than 50 persons shall hold in an enclosed space except for religious purposes, in which case the gathering shall not exceed 50% capacity of the space. 3. All persons in public gatherings, whether in enclosed or open spaces, shall adhere to the provisions of Part 2 of these regulations. 4. The provisions of these regulations may be varied by guidelines and protocols as may be issued from time to time by the Presidential Task Force, that's the PTF, on COVID-19 on the recommendation of the Nigeria Center for Disease Control. So it goes on. There are provisions where they talk about the penalty for this, which happens to be Part 4, 31, that's under offenses and penalties. Any person who contravenes the provisions of these regulations commits an offense. 32, any person who, without reasonable cause, contravenes a direction given under Parts 1 and 2 of these regulations commits an offense. Then Part 33, any person who, without reasonable cause, obstructs as authorized official from enforcement of these regulations commits an offense. And then 34 of the same Part 4 says, an offense under these regulations is punishable on summary conviction by a fine or a term of 6 months imprisonment or both in accordance with Section 5 of the Quarantine Act. So, gentlemen, let's get to it. Let me start with you, Dr. Ananaba. As a lawyer, coming up with this, there's been several people trying to internalize this in their own way. How does this sit for you in terms of implementation and the signing of this law?
Well, I think that it is good that our government is a lot more proactive at this point. Obviously, we've been ignited by what is going on across the globe, particularly in the United Kingdom. Theirs took off on January 6th. So since within January, our country is able to put up its own. I applaud that. We should be proactive in these health issues. Gone are the days when it was being discussed as to whether COVID-19 is here or not, whether it is serious or not. Most households can now say, yes, there is COVID-19. And so we need to deal with it and deal decisively with it. You are asking whether these restrictions can be enforced. In my part of the world, we used to say that you don't tell the deaf man that war has begun. As people are dying continuously now, nobody will tell his friend that there is need to comply with these regulations. That will reduce the requirement for enforcement. But I do not think we have the personnel to enforce. If you look at the regulation, it goes back to the police, civil defense, although it has fan, road safety and all that. But I would have thought that there will be special health enforcement team that will be enforcing this COVID-19 framework, because it is a very serious pandemic. Nobody can doubt that. You could see the figures everywhere. Perhaps if we have had that earlier, this resurgence may not have come to the point it is now. Let me also tell you that if we are talking about enforcement, the regulation says it's a summary offense. So I'll be asking some questions as to, will the enforcement judicial system be the overcrowded courts, the overcrowded magistrate courts? The regulation does not say whether mobile COVID-19 courts will be set up or temporary courts for that will be set up. Those are the issues. That's my first thought as I respond to your question. Thank you.
Because thinking about that as well, and then looking through some of these provisions, because they said the police are expected to enforce this. So what comes to people's mindset is that, well, who knows, if they see that you're not complying with that, or if they, in their own estimation, think that there's a violation, they arrest the person, and then who knows, at this point, it may be that they take them to the courts. But when they then talk about any person who, without reasonable cause, what do people expect in that case? Because can people hide under that and say, no, there's a reasonable cause as to why I'm doing A, B, C, or D? And who determines what is reasonable cause?
Well, the regulation defined to some extent what is reasonable cause. The regulation says, talks about medical emergency that will require that, particularly that can excuse someone. It talks about natural disaster, and then it talks about other compelling situations. So you get to the point that reasonable cause is not completely let loose. So it has to be something that has to do with medical emergency or natural disaster or compelling circumstances along that line. So you don't come up and invent your own reasonable cause. And of course, you see, when the law talks about summary trial and conviction, before you will have the time to do or bring up all these issues as to why you have a reasonable cause outside these well-established ones, you would have been convicted anyway. But the issue is, which courts? Will there be tribunals? Have you gone to the courts and to see how crowded the courts are? Particularly when the shutdowns also compounded the huge caseload of the courts. How many people will you take to court in a day? Which courts? Who will take them? Are the security agencies themselves complying with this? And let me also give you a striking feature of this regulation. The regulation excludes face shield. So if you're on face shield, you will be arrested. How would that translate in practice? Those are the questions.
Well, okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. Prof, I know that the government has expressed, the PTF now, they've expressed frustration at different times as to Nigerians not complying with this, how we need to improve compliance and observing those protocols. They go on and on. But do you think that in terms of our approach, do we really need the law to ensure people comply, a law such as this one?
Thank you very much. It's 11 months now since we had the first case, and we're just getting off a law. or regulation, as the president calls it, to for most people abide by those non-pharmaceutical interventions. I think it's 11 months too late. And if you look, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure the sound will let us know. We're using a law that was in existence since 1926, if I remember, during the quarantine law of 1926, although amended at different stages and times. So first of all, that also tells you about what kind of country we are. If we had to wait on use a law of 19, which has not been really thoroughly amended. If you check that law, it talks, the disease is talking about smallpox, which had been eradicated more than I don't know how many years ago. So I think the ideal thing would be persuasion. We have failed in that. But even if you look at the regulation, it says the responsibility is on the people. I mean, if you own a premises, and if you as an individual, I think the responsibility should be on you. Ideally, as the son has said, the complication of getting all this, enforcing the law in the constitution where we are. And I know, I mean, like we all know, it just takes a little bit of one person to enrich their pocket rather than enforce the law. These are some of the areas. So rather, I would wish that we have spent our time more on persuasion. And I said it at the beginning, that if the government had laid the emphasis on the fact that the most important person in control is not the PTF, it's not the president, it's you, it's me as an individual. If we have been carrying that message right from the beginning, I think maybe we'll be better off than having this law, which, as you said, we have difficulties enforcing the law. But that's why I keep going back to that the responsibility is on whoever owns the premises or you as an individual. So that's my point about it.
Yeah, but Prof, how do we persuade people? Because this law even covers markets, malls, open places, and they're supposed to be liable as well. So one wonders, in terms of, because they say they've been talking about this for a long time, and people just don't seem to comply. Can we persuade people in a market area to comply with this? How is that going to work?
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, you for persuasion, you keep at it. You keep showing, it is kind of how you bring the awareness. You keep bringing to the realization of the people, in other parts of the world. Here we hide those things. It's only recently when a few big people get sick or die that we talk about it. Of the thousands of people, of the over 100,000 cases that we have now, how many of the people on the road have died that we have actually brought out to the public? When you bring that information closer to home, when a senator dies, who cares? How does it affect me? But when my neighbor dies, when my breadwinner dies, then those are the things we should be stressing, rather than putting all the emphasis on one or two so-called big men who die. We should get down to the level of the people. A has died, is from this village. B has died, is from that village. And then we bring it down to people then begin to realize that it affects me as much as it's not just for the big men alone.
Well, Prof, still talking about that persuasion, because it was something that came quite strongly on my mind in preparing, for this conversation with you, because clearly a lot of information has been deployed to people, but when it comes to communication, taking it even further down to persuasive communication, is essentially saying that people need to own the process. Now, by these regulations, the president is putting the responsibility of deploying this persuasive communication, if you want to put it like that way, on the operators of the various open places, parks, leisure parks, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, schools, and the rest of them, to take charge of ensuring this. But in terms of persuasive communication, you have also told us all of you in the medical practice have told us that there could be complications even for those who recover from COVID-19. So perhaps the death of someone may not be the only thing that we want to deploy in terms of persuasive communication. So taking it down to the people for them to own the process, other than the death of a neighbor and how it affects someone close to people, what other things should be involved or included in the persuasive communication to the people?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll go back by the example we had with the polio in Nigeria. You remember there was a time when people boycotted the polio vaccine. It took for us to get the people back, to get down in the northern parts of the country where it is a little easier, to get down to the traditional ruler, to the village head, to the ward head, to the family head. It took for that message to use what the people are commonly used to, like the village jester, the village clown, or what do you call it, the village musician, to get involved. We brought this right down to the level of the people, and that convinced them. And you brought people who had the disease, people who had the disease themselves to come in and join in that population. So like you said, people must own it. It must get to the level. So when I saw all these, it is a responsibility of that, it is a responsibility of that, I kept laughing that we don't seem to have learned from the errors of the past, of the lessons of the past that we have with polio. We should have deployed this information. And it's not now. I mean, the internet, the social media has been loaded with all kinds of information. We had to be proactive, as Stan said, to counter those missions as they are occurring and not wait for this. Let me give you one little example. You remember when we had the drop in numbers at a particular time, I think it was during the summer holidays. We suddenly started having drops in number. And then the message got dropped, oh, COVID is gone. It took the PTF another 2 weeks to say that because we're not testing during the summer holidays that we had those drop numbers. But then it was too late. People had already believed that the thing was gone. So all those, and then people coming out at that time for PTF to say it. Also when they say, oh no, you see, we never trusted data before, that kind of thing. So you have to be proactive. When anybody says something against it and you have the fact, give it and give all the facts. Don't leave any gaps. The gaps are meant to be filled by social media. And when the government says I'm doing this, I'm not doing it, say what you are not doing. Tell the people how much you are. It's a human thing. And let people know that they're not all supreme. So when you say I succeeded in doing this, then tell them where you have not succeeded. And people can take you for what you're saying. And when you now bring these messages around, people then begin to believe you.
Well, it's interesting, Prof, you speak about filling some gaps. So let me take this to Dr. Ananaba, because looking at the regulations, some say there are gaps that need to be filled. There are areas we need to understand what this means. You ended by talking about reasonable cause and how this regulation defines reasonable cause. But you also said that it didn't quite define it well enough, because you see that it ends by saying ETC. So really ETC is ETC, anything. So help us understand this part 3 that talks about mandatory compliance with treatment protocols. And 27 says persons confirmed to have tested positive to COVID-19 by an NCDC accredited laboratory may not refuse isolation and or admission to a designated health establishment for management of the disease. That has been quite an issue. So when you see may not, does that mean they have to comply, or they have the choice to comply, or otherwise? What does that mean, really?
Well, thank you. You see that this is these are legal provisions. When the law makes an exception for reasonable cause, it will now say may not, because if you have reasonable cause, you will not be found liable. That's what that means. But beyond that, I have an expert in the medical field here, a prof, distinguished professor. I don't know whether he will agree with me that these regulations, yes, they came 11 months late. These regulations did not go far enough. Because, it's not only issues of where warship, buses, ship, aircraft that are the issues. There's several other points which we covered. One is this issue of stay at home, outdoor services, hospitality, tourism, and all that. There's several issues that I thought if administrations that there have been more experts
because of the question. So, pardon me, it's a bit shaky with the connection. Since you brought in Prof earlier, let's see if he agrees with you. I'd also like to put in the fact that, so you've talked about we needing persuasion more than regulation, even though you say the regulations came 11 months late. Do you think that maybe if we're talking about something comprehensive, maybe the NCDC bill, in quote, that was what people called it. Do you think the NCDC bill that caused a lot of controversy last year would have been comprehensive enough?
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree very much with the stand that the thing is not comprehensive enough. As it is, to me, it looked like it was a kind of rush regulation. There are a lot of gaps in there. However, that is the point. There's no way you can make a law that will address every conceivable situation. And that's where you and I come in. And I keep saying it that the law is okay for those who will disobey. Every country has had the law. But then, in addition to the law, is the fact that the level of compliance in those countries are much, much higher than our own. Therefore, their laws, are very easy to follow over there. People will follow the law, will go along with it as much as possible. It's almost the reverse here. It's like, I'm sorry to say to the lawyer, here in Nigeria, it's like when the laws are made, the first thing we start thinking of, how do we break that law? How do we go around it? How do we, circumscribe the law and so on that nature? If that is this first set, my first reaction when I saw that thing was that they are creating opportunity for whoever is going to enforce the law to make money in his pocket. That's the kind of the nature of our country. And that's why I think it is important that it's going to be really difficult. Well, I remember the NCDC bill that you were talking of, in which people said was too draconian. Of course, yes, some of it was draconian, but it was much more detailed than this one. And that way, I actually addressed every issue. But I'm sure even the areas where there are those draconian laws, there are also lawyers who are there to make amends, either in the law courts or something, to ensure that nobody's individual right is contravened. However, it's a balance between my right and your right. Mm-hmm. If you're going to insist on your right and insist on mine, then there's a big of a problem.
All right, Prof. Dr. Ananaba, let's bring you in as we wind down on this one in less than 60 seconds, if you can. Do you see this being enforced in a sense that we don't compound what we're trying to guard against in the first place? By that, I mean, if one is arrested for, quote unquote, allegedly or suspected to have violated this, how are they supposed to prove it, wherever they take the person to, that he was arrested because he violated it?
Those are the issues I harped on earlier. I agree with Prof that this regulation was rushed. Perhaps when the UK did theirs on the 6th of January, so we needed to also show we can put up our own regulations. Otherwise, it needed some deep thoughts. For example, there's nothing about funeral service there.
No.
There's nothing about neighbors. There's nothing about exercise. There's nothing about how long you should, even if you will not, everything must not be sanctioned. About regulation on going out, working from home. For example, some employers are going to fire some employees for not coming to work. These are all regulations that will people know. Employers begin to think, okay, we should now begin to reduce the number of days we are working. And like in my office, I've reduced the number of days each worker will come to work. Now, when you talk about compounding, it will certainly compound it. Where do we have, if somebody is sentenced to 6 months on this point, do you know that in a day across the country, there may be conviction for up to 5,000 persons? Where do you have the detention centers? And before the detention centers will accept these people, they will have to go through COVID tests.
And when they are accepted, these are issues that we're going to keep focusing on as we progress. But actually, I think there's a part there, part 2, when it talks about operation of public places, they did actually talk about fitness centers. So perhaps that talks about the exercise areas. But
no, that's
so
not
many
what
areas.
I'm talking about. Sorry, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about exercise in your neighborhood.
Oh,
People play football on the streets.
well,
They are regulating. I'm not. That's what I'm saying. It needed to be comprehensive enough. When you step out of your house with your neighbors to do exercise, must it not be? Must it be regulated? Can't we spread COVID on that? These are the points. So by and large, I think that having this is better than not having any at all. And I also want to make the point that since it is quarantine, under the Quarantine Act, it's in the exclusive legislative list, no state should start tinkering with this. We should apply it as is because it is from the exclusive legislative list. I want to call on the bar, the NMA, and other safety professionals to come in. These regulations can be reviewed so that we'll deepen it and make it richer and more robust and helpful to Nigerians. Thank you.
And we'll also continue that conversation.